A debate in a moment around the line between legal protest and illegal criminality. Meanwhile, the eThekwini municipality has confirmed a video circulating on Twitter regarding what appears to be Metro Police in Durban looting goods as fake. The city says law enforcement officials weren't looting, but were confiscating goods from looters. In a statement, the city has clarified that all of the items recovered from the incident have now been registered with the SAPS. Reports also said that several arrests had been made of people who had been looting in that area. Well, let's have a conversation now around the violence, the looting and the protests that we've seen over the last 3 days, particularly in Gauteng and Kwazulu-Natal. As you've seen, they continue tonight. Let me introduce Peter Nsime, is the Acting Deputy General Secretary of the South African Policing Union. Tanvir Jiwa is a legal analyst. And Sally Malamacha is an attorney focusing on protest law, someone who often advises people who are taking part in protests. Good evening to you all. Stanley, if I may just start with you, the arrests, the looting, the protests that we've seen, the violence that we've seen, do you see this action as protest action, or is this something else?
Thank you for having me. And I think that is a brilliant question. And if one looks at Section 17 of the Constitution, it guarantees, protects, and promotes everyone's right to protest. But it also guides, or it also puts in obligations on how to protest. So immediately when a protest erupts into violence and the protesters are unarmed, the protest loses the protection of the Constitution. So surely what we are seeing now, we can't say that this is a protest that is within the confines of the Constitution. Or even for that matter, I don't think it is fair even to categorize what we are seeing at the moment as a protest.
Tanvir, I mean, would you agree with that? And I'm thinking of poor police officers, and Peter and Sima, I'm going to get to you in a moment, who have to try and work out where the line is. Where does a protest lose the protection of the Constitution?
Hi, Stephen. Thank you so much for having me again. I think what's also really important is that this did start out as a protest, but we're seeing a lot of people looting, and we have to draw the line between people who are being opportunistic and taking advantage of this quote-unquote cause for a lot of people to actually go and loot the different areas. I think beyond the need and necessity for the police to draw a distinction between who are protesters and who aren't, I think the SAPS simply must abide to their own guidelines as to the excessive use of force. So it's not necessarily important for them to make the distinctions as much as it's necessary for them to really mitigate the way they're using force against everyone involved, because everyone still has a right to appear in front of court, and at the end of the day, SAPS is not executioner or judge themselves. So I think, to me, that would be most important distinction.
Stanley, I mean, I can just imagine the legal arguments that there could be around what is an act of violence. So, for example, some people would say, and I think with some justification, that words are violence. If someone were to swear at a police officer, is that violence? I mean, if the police officer swore back, what is that? If the police officer pushed, what is that? What happens if one person in a protest pushes, let's say, a man pushes a female police officer? That female police officer and other police officers around her may feel that that officer is a victim of violence.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, if I draw your attention to the jurisprudence of protest, and especially the concept of violence. So before a constitutional court case that I will discuss later, before that case, when we speak about violence in protest, violence is constituted if there's a threat or an act a threat or an act to injure someone or to injure their property. So it is clear that our Constitution does not allow or protect acts or threats of violence. Now, before the case that I'm to refer you to is famously known as the Colenso case. Now, in that case, it was sustained that even a conduct that is not per se violent during a protest, for the mere fact that it has the potential to infringe on other people's rights, then that can it can sustain a charge of the common law offense of violence. So normally when you see in protests, the most predominant charge that comes with protests is public violence. And, so our right to protest is quite fragile, and it is a right that is capable of attracting a lot of criminal elements. This is why we are seeing the situation now. It is so fragile that even those who want to maintain a peaceful protest can quickly be hijacked by criminal elements. So yes, absolutely, pushing someone during a protest, threatening someone during a protest, that constitutes violence. Torching someone's vehicle, breaking someone's house, that constitutes violence, absolutely.
Peter and Sima, I mean, we've seen throughout the day, and we're seeing pictures now of police officers who've really been in a position where it's been impossible, and I'm not criticizing them at all, I'm supporting them when I say this. I think it would have been impossible for them to have stopped the looting that we've seen at Jabulani Mall today. There have just been too many people there. In Alexandra on Saturday night, I think there were 800 people. I mean, there just aren't enough police officers to deal with that. This must just be a very, very tough time for your members.
Indeed, our members are overwhelmed. It is very difficult for our members at the moment. But I think as a union, we need to applaud our members with regard to how they have handled the matter up to now. We're trying our level best not to lose life, as much as we know that 9 people have lost their life. We come from an era where police officers are blamed for almost everything, and every time when they have to implement the law to the latter, you are reminded of the Marikana and the previous events. So our members are working under a very extreme difficult situation currently, but we are trying our level best. This situation in the country now does not really need the police officers. The situation needs leadership in the country. They need political leadership. You cannot have a situation, police officers are not Holy Spirit. We cannot be everywhere every time. We need to have a situation where leadership, they have to rise above the level. Those who have elected them in leadership, they must now talk to their own people and say, look, this is the situation. The consequences of what is happening today, we are not going to feel it today, but I can tell you, in years to come, we are going to feel the very serious, severe economic impact of what is happening today. Indeed, our members, it's very difficult for them, are very struggling with the situation currently.
And I mean, the other thing about this, Peter, and you're a unionist, you represent police officers, you will know this better than anyone. They're in negotiations for salaries. Everyone knows police don't get paid what they're worth to society. They don't get paid anything like the value they give to society. This must make it even harder for them.
Indeed, as much as we even said it last year when the president announced the lockdown, the police officers were on the forefront. Every time people were every day they were in their own houses, police officers are working. Today we are faced with the situation, police officers are still working. The question that always comes from our members is very simple. How much can we go? Why are we not getting our danger allowance? Why are we not getting enough pay? And this is a situation that we are faced with. But as a union, we are responsible. This situation currently, we have to deal with the stability in the country. We have to deal with what the law says. Our job in terms of the constitution is to make sure that we protect life, we protect property. Then from there, the government and those in leadership must be able to look at what police officers are doing. Every time when there's a crisis, police officers are put in the front seat. When things are stable in the country, then everybody wants to say, no, police officers are not people to look at. Indeed, we are trying to talk with our members and engage with them. They are working on a daily basis. You can see what happened last night. Police officers are deemed to be looking at the looting, and not just because they want to, but they are faced with the situation of saying, how do we deal with the situation? If you enforce the law, you will be labeled as trigger happy. If you look at the people and they just loot, and people are saying police are not doing their best, but we can assure you that our members are trying their level best in this situation.
Tanvir Jiwa, in the middle of all of this, we have what I think many people would see as incitement. And I'm talking about what we see on social media. Sometimes these are relatives of prominent people. There is, I think we could safely say, at least one prominent political leader who may be accused of incitement from what they've said on Twitter today. Are people breaking the law when they do this?
I think a lot of people are, and I don't think they're mindful enough of the law in that instance. I mean, as you've mentioned, we've seen former President Jacob Zuma's family members calling on to people to gather, and I think that's why it was so important what my colleague Mr. Nsime just said in terms of we need political leadership, and right now what we don't need is to call on to more people to gather. As you can see, things are getting out of hand on an extremely tough level. The police doesn't know what to do because they're trying to mitigate their own reactions to what's going on. And at the end of the day, we really do highlight the fact that there's a duty on the police officers to not use excessive force, but also we acknowledge that there's a duty on the public, political leaders, and also members who are highly prominent on social media and generally influential, that they should not call onto people because to gather and to loot and just to cause general unrest, because at the end of the day, these are definitely things that are unlawful. You are not allowed to incite violence. And in many ways, I think what's also really interesting, Stephen, is the fact that a lot of people are quote unquote smart enough to know how to toe the line in terms of saying things that don't necessarily amount to incitement under the law, but definitely get people to still get riled up and loot and protest on other conditions.
Tandria Jiwa, the legal analyst, Stanley Malamacha, an attorney focusing on the law around protests, and the acting Deputy General Secretary of the South African Police Union, Peter Nseme. Thank you all for your time tonight.